That's probably a good sort of kickoff point, but I would say that with the gathering we have here, the kingdom ought to come down. Where I start right here. And that's not so far from how the whole life model happened. And that is, we had all of these counseling, deliverance, pastoral ministries, churches, and things like that, none of whom could agree about how things worked. So back in the, well, I'll tell you my little part about it. I was an intern at Shepherd's House, the Life Model Works parent organization. And because I was the intern, they said, well, you have to revise our intake form, which had been Xeroxed so many times that it was all spots and you couldn't read it. So I had to create the new form. And because of the trend of the time there in the 70s, there was beginning to be a little talk about abuse and trauma. And so I asked the counseling center, I said, have you ever had an abused person come in here for therapy? And the whole staff discussed it for some time, and they came to the conclusion that maybe they'd had one. Or, well, depending on how you thought about it, there might have been two in the history of the counseling center. So, because I said I thought I'd put a question on the intake form about this, you're wasting the paper. Because, you know, they don't come around, they don't have any, you know, and we're not even sure you should even ask such a thing. Well, being a very stubborn intern, I'd only put on one question, I put on 3 questions. I put a question not only about whether you'd experienced it, but whether you'd witnessed it, and you know, things like, you know, related to that sort of thing. And you will not at all be surprised that kind of from that day on, everybody coming in checked all 3, right? And it wasn't long before, because we're the only counseling center talking about it, we had 200 churches referring people to us for this issue, especially abuse of children and women, which was just being sort of talked about right there. It was very strange to me that on our checklist were these checklists, but we were also subscribing to Psychology Today. And in Psychology Today, in the issue that was sitting in our office, it was written by a number of psychiatrists and professors describing why parents should be the ones that introduce their own children to sexuality. So your first sexual experience should be with your father or mother, as they should teach you how it works instead of having these bumbling young teenagers teaching your children how to be sexual. So I was mindful that on the one hand, I was asking these questions, and yet our culture was at the point where Psychology Today would be publishing articles like that from university and leading psychiatrists. So you see when you look back, you may not be aware of the milieu all of this grew out of. So when I'm saying there was not a whole lot of agreement about what it is that you do if you want to help people get better, there was a whole lot of non-agreement going on. So we had these people who had some trauma, and we realized that if you want to deal with people's trauma, you have to kind of be gentle with them. But a lot of them had addictions, and this was the time that the Minnesota model for treatment had just come out for addictions. And what you do with people with addictions is you confront them and you make sure you don't coddle them in the slightest. So you had to be very confrontive, very vigorous, very, hardly a kind word, because what you were trying to do is make sure that they hit the bottom. The harder and the faster they hit the bottom, the better a chance they had. So we had that, and of course that group felt that all drugs were bad, so you shouldn't give anything for depression or any other kind of medication. There should be no medication whatsoever if you're going to deal with your addictions, because they thought it was a problem with taking pills, which, if you know our theory, the problem of addiction doesn't grow out of pills, it grows out of attachment. But that's getting ahead of the story, right? And then we had people who over here were running deliverance ministries. And they were quite sure that no medication or no addictions or none of these other things, if you had a depression, you cast it out. And if you had an addiction, you cast it out. And if you had a trauma, you cast it out. And if you heard a voice in your head, you cast it out. And Didn't matter if it was a little child voice or what, you got rid of all that. And so they had their model. And then we had the healing prayer model people, and they were, they were speaking words into people's lives. And if you just could say the right thing, and so we had all of these, that's just a few, right? And then we had all the professional people so we actually gathered a group of close to 40. How many do we have in here now today? It's a little 55. So it's almost a group this size. And we began to meet for a while to say, what is the essential overlapping explanation that would work for why all of these things are happening? You can't have a different model for every thing that goes wrong. There's one human being, and and what you teach them for evangelism, for parenting, and for diagnosing brain tumors ought to be the same model. You should be able off of that to figure out what they should have for medication, what they should do about demons. The whole thing should be consistently fitting together in some way or another. Otherwise, you're really not dealing with a human being. God knows what you're trying to deal with, but you're trying to remove little problems here or there that seem to be interconnected. Right? Why is it that every single person we have a trauma history has some kind of addiction running? And if the treatments are completely incompatible with each other, what are you going to do about that, right? And the joke was that everyone who comes in to our counseling center reports they have a sexual problem actually has a spiritual problem. And everyone who comes in and says they have a spiritual problem actually has a sexual problem. It was sort of a joke, but it wasn't that funny because it seemed to be 100% true. So how do you put all of that together? So we actually convened this group, and we wanted a model for life, wouldn't you say? How life should be run. And so we realized that actually, if you're, now because we have children, right, and we've got a developmental program, that what we're trying to do with the 3-year-olds really isn't quite the same as what we're trying to do with the 30-year-olds. And so whatever this model is ought to be broken down according to where you are in life. And so that began to introduce an idea of, well, what would you call those parts? Well, those are sort of stages for life, right? So different stages, you need different things. And that made sense to us. And we went to Scripture and we said, whatever model ought to be true ought to be reflected in Scripture, because that's the truth for all humanity. So this is every person on earth, whatever is true in the Bible ought to fit for them. And so is there a language in Scripture that's used to talk about maturity? And sure enough, we looked in both the Greek and the Hebrew. They consistently talked about infant, child, adult, parent, and elder. And it was always there. In fact, sometimes they modified it. You might have a young child or a young adult. But there was these categories with modifiers and then we decided to consult with every language we could possibly find in every culture that we could locate around the world and see if these categories existed everywhere. Because we were looking for a non-Western model. One of our conclusions was, whatever is really true should explain the same thing that Western science does. So it should fit. The good science should fit this thing, but you shouldn't have to know Western science in order to understand what's basically true about being human. So that began to introduce this other element, that we needed to have something that was true for all human beings living in human bodies, and also true for everybody who looked at Scripture, because both things had to apply to all people. So really the essence of neurotheology, which has been practiced in the church, I mentioned since 390 was with the year 390 was the first book on neurotheology written for the church. It's how do you actually live out spiritual truths with a physical brain? How do you teach this to do what God wants you to do? When you put those together, you should get how your life should look. And it should look like nothing we've ever seen. So we decided we were not going to take an actuarial model. So we wouldn't go out and survey the average 7-year-old to find out what a 7-year-old should look like. We were going to look at, if nothing went wrong with your development, you had everything necessary to become the person God meant you to be, what would you look like at 7? So it was called, in that sense, an idealized model, because we're actually trying to achieve the ideal, not the average. And what we then discovered was that trauma stops you from developing your maturity in some zone of your life. So if you have been traumatized in the area of your sexuality, your identity as a whatever your gender is and how you relate to other people stops developing right. For one thing, every area of your life should develop joyfully. And the first thing is the joy goes right out of it. So this, whatever it is, no longer is a joyful area of my life. It's now painful. And instead of working to figure out how I'm going to make it grow, I work to avoid any contact with it. So if, let's say, I'm trying to learn the guitar, if I'm trying to joyfully engage with the guitar every time I see one, I'm going to have a different pattern than if every time I see a guitar I try to fearfully avoid it. I mean, you're just going to have a different thing. And what we discovered before too long was that if you could resolve trauma, whatever skills you're supposed to have developed in that area of your life weren't there. So to say, for instance, if somebody broke all their fingers, they couldn't play the piano, and someone else was taking piano lessons. If we could heal your fingers so you get movement back in them, you were not the same piano player as the person that had been practicing it for the last 2 years. Now, there's nothing about healing you that gave you back what you hadn't had a chance to develop. So that immediately began to put us on a different grid. Where you were in your life development was going to be a very important issue to what you should have developed by now. And what areas of your life had been traumatized would point to what needed to be healed, but also, once healed, what needed to be regrown and developed and learned once again. And this already, as you will see, has us on almost a different page than any other counseling method. Because you cast out a demon, which often needs to be cast out, it doesn't teach you everything that demon was getting in the way of your learning along the way, right? So we actually need something that's going to teach us what we don't know yet about being mature, or that is to say, being fully human at my age and place and time, and how somebody like me would look if I hadn't been hit by the bus, right? So this by itself is a fairly simple model. And it took us a while to do that. We came up with close to 50 elements that we thought of, these are elements of being human. And we thought, well, let's write down the first one. And the first one is that you should live from the heart that Jesus gave you. That central to all of this, and what we meant by the heart, was God has placed some identity within you. And if you don't find it and live from that, none of this other stuff is going to grow right. So I can't put somebody else's identity in you. I must find the one that God put in you, and we're going to live according to that. And if we can make that develop and take out the blocks in the way, then we're going to develop whoever God meant you to be. And that's the task that we ought to all be about. That was principle number 1 out of 50. So we decided at that point, we had this big debate within our staff. And these things, you look back historically, they're almost hilarious now. But I was the one that insisted that we should call it a life model. The rest of the staff is going, nobody will ever understand that term, and don't use the word maturity, because mature means that it has adult themes in it, or it belongs in the geriatric department. So maturity, no one will understand maturity. And so, again, being the stubborn guy that put the 3 questions on the questionnaire, I said, well, you're going to have to put that in the subtitle. You're going to have to say the life model. And they obliged me, because I argued for weeks. Um, and the odd thing, everyone was going like, people seem to refer to this book as the life model. It's actually one of the 50 elements, more or less, of the life model. So the life model is actually not something I came up with. It's something this community of about 40 people, 30 to 40 people, came up with, trying to figure out how this all come together. What are the things that are central to everything? And then we started to write that down again as a community. Now, the way we decided was, well, we're going to try to make the book as short as possible to say what we know. So we're going to make it as concentrated as possible. And people have ever since said, you know, this reads like drinking concentrated orange juice. I have to stop and read every sentence. So, well, that's what we were aiming at, because the book was only supposed to last 3 years till we could get around to writing what we wanted to write. But, you know, we had to sort of get the essence out, right? And so it became sort of that little essence. And the next thing that we decided was that we were not going to write out implementations. So instead of looking around the world to find everything that worked and trying to figure out some way to pack it together, we kind of had an image in our mind of a old prospector with a mule. And so many of the counselors and pastors we knew were like an old prospector with a mule. Every time they picked up a new tool, they would hang it on that mule, and we'd go out and find out when I needed this tool or that tool. So you have all of these tools, which if you happen to remember which tool might be a good one right now, can make you actually, you can get a lot of work done that way. But it doesn't actually fit together. There's no particular rationale to how this all is. And if you had to try to figure out which tool to use, you couldn't figure it out by looking at the mule. You know, if you happen to know what you hang on the mule, you could figure out which one you wanted to use, but all that logic had to be in every person. And that was the model for counseling at that point, and still is in many places. And that is, we'll teach you as many different models as we can cram into your head, and then you can pick the things that work for you. Well, this was not to be a pick the things that work for you model, and it's been one of the reasons why it's been difficult actually to get it to spread through professionals. And that is because professionals already have a set of tools. They got a mule, and they don't want to trade the mule for a llama. But at some point or another, they realize that the model challenges the way that they do transformation. And what we decided to do is we were going to let transformation challenge everything we did or thought as a model. If it didn't bring about enduring transformation, then this had to be improved some way or another. And so that's what we began to do then. We're going to let's get the essential ingredients that explain as clearly as possible how things work. And from that, we should be able to explain why all of the tools that work well. And then you can add your tool back in as you say, oh, well, that works in this way or that way or the other way. So that's how we actually spent the first 15 years making sure we never gave people tools to work with. We would give them explanations from which they could figure out, oh, that explains why. And the most common response we have to the life model is, you've given us words to explain why. You've given us a framework to explain why the things that I understand actually work. It fits into this, and repeatedly. The wonderful thing is I can go to Chiapas, Mexico, and talk to people who the best of them has a second grade education, and this makes intuitive sense to them. That's how people work. And then I remember the first time I was talking at a national convention, everyone there was professional, and I had neurologists in there, including and I remember this case was the head neurologist for the state of Arkansas was there, ran all of the state hospitals and systems, and I'm explaining to him, you know, how the brain works, and I'm totally intimidated as I'm sitting up there, and he's looking at me like, you're saying what? Just this, you know, never twitched a muscle on his face, never smiled, never cracked anything. I'm like, oh boy. And after I tell you the story, I'll go back to how the brain got to be a part of this. But at the end of it, I saw him making a beeline for me, and I thought, oh boy. And he said, you know what, when I listened to you today, I understood for the first time how the brain works. And I went, oh, that's intimidating. But what we had done, and again, going back to this, I love it, we've got some interns here, because in this case, it was my turn to pick on another intern. We got these brochures that kept coming through us, and one came from the Newport Beach Psychoanalytic Association. Now, I got about 5 brochures a day, and they went into the trash, most of them as fast as they could come out of the envelope. And if there was ever a group that went into the trash as fast as you could throw it, it was the Newport Beach Psychoanalytic Association. The snobbiest of all of the groups in Southern California. And they never got past discussing, the finer points of Freud, who was, I could find no value whatsoever in going down there. For one thing, the cars driven by members of the Shepherd's House staff and the cars driven by the Newport Beach Psychoanalytic Association couldn't even be in the same parking lot, really, it was just completely different. But this one, as I'm going like that, almost sticks to my finger, and the thought goes through my mind extremely loud, someone has to go to this. And I went, well, not me, Lord. So I went to staff meeting, and we said, one of you has to go to this. Who's free that weekend? Only one intern was. Everyone else had an excuse. They're going, oh, I don't have to go. So this one intern said, well, we'll pay your way, you go on down. And who was speaking there was Alan Shore, who I'd never heard of, on the neurobiology of attachment, which is a topic I'd never heard about and could care less about. And so there was no reason whatsoever. I just said, you just have to go. And went home that weekend, glad I wasn't there. And he came back the next Monday, and I remember his eyes were big. He said, when I went down there, there was this guy, Alan Shore, and he sat and he read the text to his next book. He said, I don't think I understood very many sentences, but I bought the complete set of tapes because you know what? Cassette tapes. Anyone remember cassette tapes? Yeah, that was a big set of cassette tapes right there. He said, because all of the dates and ages that we have put for development, he matched right down to the month with something happening in the brain. We have to look at what's happening in the brain because something happens in there that matches the stuff we pulled out of the Bible right down to the month. And, we got to go listen to that. So I assigned this to several staff members, and they brought the tapes back and go, I can't make any sense out of this. So I thought, my wife loves listening to tapes. I'll let her listen to these tapes. That didn't last a half hour. She brought it back. And so they said, no, you're going to have to listen to these tapes yourself. So what I did then is I sat down and I'd play a sentence and I'd stop the tape. Okay, now the first word. Yeah, okay, I know that word. Oh, second word. Yeah, all right. Third word. 5 words. 5. Never heard them be together. Whoa, that's brilliant. Let me think about that. Next sentence. And at that point, a group of neurologists at UCLA were trying to study through his book. That was his first book, and it took the group of them 9 months as a group together to figure out, reading through his first book, which had the last 200 pages are footnotes, what he was talking about. This is his next book, more advanced than that. And this is the first one is a book of how it all develops, and the second book was how do you actually implement this to correct problems. And so 5 years before the book was published, we had the text on this tape, and we went through and we said, oh, this is how the brain changes. But as far as he knows, it's only been done with parents and children. It's never been done with an adult brain, especially if their parents weren't there to help. So we had to ask the question, could an adult brain learn how to be human if it didn't know how? And it hadn't been taught at the right time in the right place by the right people. At that point, I met a young man named Chris Coursey, who said, I would be willing, if you set up the experiments, I'd be willing to run them and let's see if we can make this happen. And so we began to design, okay, now the best way to do this, you have to have like a bond of some kind between the people, because this is all grows around joy. And the thing that we already knew as counselors is that most of the trouble that we are having in counseling involved joy. It either involved people whose joy was way too low, or people who found joy in the wrong places. So most of the pastors that came in had had a very low joy marriage and ministry, worked all right for about the first 15 years, and then somebody started bringing joy in their life and being exciting to be with them, and all of a sudden they had what we call a moral failure. And time after time we were doing all of these autopsies, you might call them, on ministry failures, because they're coming our way, and every single one of them involved somebody who was doing one of two things. They were low joy and they had no idea, and the first joy that they really encountered in a long time was irresistible to them, or they were doing ministry job that required more maturity than they had. So if they were trying to do a job like deal with the community while they still had little children, and they were ready for parent maturity but they weren't ready for elder maturity, they would pretty soon get in trouble. And for one thing, the joy would run out of them as well. I mean, so you do something that's too hard for your maturity level, what happens is you can do it, but you get no joy in doing it. Now you're living a low joy life because you have to do all of these things. So we're looking at all of these things, these things fit together. So how do we go about explaining them to other people? And I began to be the one who tried to look for a sort of a common language or model or way to explain it that would work for people who understood different models and yet still translate to other cultures. And so that's become my job. I'm sort of the guy that tries to put this together in the most basic and concentrated form. It's also the hardest to use form. I sort of think of it as though I was the physicist who's deciding, kind of figuring out how things actually work. And what we actually want to do is build houses for poor people that endure in spite of storms. Well, you can't just hand the physics over to somebody and go, now make a nice house out of that. You actually hand that over to engineers who can at least understand the physicist. And they've got to translate it so that architects can understand it, and architects have to translate it so people building things can understand it, and you move down the line that way till eventually you get somebody that goes, well, I'm building this what looks like extremely low-tech house using the highest tech design possible. And that's also been a team. But usually I'm the one that gets to go around talking to people. So there's this tendency, and I thank all of you for expressing gratitude towards me and what I'm doing, but I'm actually sort of in the middle of this network of stuff that's happening, and I'm passing things back and forth, and everyone thanks me for it. But I did almost none of the work. See? And now the thing is, you've become part of this network. You actually have more people here today than what developed the life model, because we decided to work together and figure out how things work. And I think giving you the elements of the life model, if you were to look around this room, again, you would say, yeah, we've got a lot of them here already. And we've got things that probably aren't even in the life model yet, over from the neurological department and the deliverance department and these ministries, you see, things that haven't been worked out. If you want this to happen in Austin or in Texas, it's because a community of you is going to get together and make this grow. It is not going to be lectures coming in from outside or even programs we develop. The programs that we developed and we have are all clearly prototypes. It's like, let's develop something well enough to see if it actually works. But, you know, prototypes are really hard to sell in a store, right? Now, the average Christian church does not believe that there's anything you can tell them about Christianity they don't already know. They're really completely uninterested in the new model, because as far as every Christian is concerned, I know everything there is to know about Christianity. What you can give me is better packaging. So if you can package this for me, I'll roll it out for you. Yeah, I need packaged stuff, you know, and if you got good packaging, we're right there. We do not have good packaging. Prototyping and good packaging don't go together. In fact, the same people that design really cool packaging are really lousy at prototyping. So we've got this constant going problem. And you folks are somewhere in that interface. You'll look at our stuff, and every time we do something, it tends to come out a little better. So people will say about the rare leadership, well, you know, I actually could sort of understand that one. That's you know, that's better than any book you've written so far. And it's true. I mean, I'm not arguing with that. Passing the piece which I handed out to you, when this one came out, people said, that's better than anything you've written so far. And that's about how to introduce in the community. But when we first started with the Immanuel process, we didn't call it the Immanuel process, right? We were at that point calling it psychotherapy. And unless you had at least a license, and well, for me, I had to have 24 years of school, 2,000 supervised hours. We didn't even start teaching it to you until you had that kind of capability behind your name. And then we would teach you how you can use this process within the environment. And it occurred to us at that point, one of the, another element of this whole model, it occurred to us at that point that we would never catch up with the size of the problem in the world. So the average pedophile will abuse about 250 children, out of which the 250 children, somewhere around 40% will go on to be pedophiles based on nothing more than that experience. So the average clinical therapist dealing with heavily traumatized people, like someone who is abused by a pedophile, will be able to help about 250 people in a career to completely recover. So at that rate, you're matching. If you put one therapist for every pedophile out there, you could keep up with, you could help as many people as they damaged, except for the fact that none of the people who are held by a therapist could go on and pass it on to anybody. You have 0% pass on. The other guy's getting 40% that are passing it on to somebody. So even if you could match the number of pedophiles with the numbers of therapists, you would lose abysmally and in very short order. So it occurred to us this cannot be God's plan. Whatever it is that ought to be transforming people has got to be a whole lot more contagious than the method we're using. And it wasn't too long after we developed it down to 7 steps that we thought you could teach to a pastor if you had, or some prayer minister in a church who had pretty good social skills and psychological skills, and if you had about 2 years to work with them, you could teach them how to do this process within their church. We had a shortage of signups, but well, it turns out the average pastor is not looking for more work to do. Right? We had all these wonderful things that we could add to their workload. They just didn't come for those seminars. If we offered the pastor something that would help him in his or her personal life, they showed up. But they wouldn't come in to learn a new way of working that could increase their workload dramatically at work for the next few years. And so That method, although we had one, was also what? You'd say very non-contagious, right? It existed, it worked. Well, then about that time along comes Ed Smith. I don't know if any of you go back far enough to know him in Theophostic, so you've heard of Ed Smith and Theophostic. Ed Smith came up with a easily taught method. And we thought, brilliant. Now he actually took EMDR and Christianized it. So Theophostic is EMDR. If you're familiar with EMDR, I won't go into the details if you're not. But it's a secular method based on helping people move their eyes and reprocess what's going on. Only instead of having people move their eyes, he just said, well, what'll happen if we invite God in? But it's essentially, Theophostic was EMDR with God. And so it was a simple method to teach. However, it has the same problem with EMDR, and that is that you can push people too far into something too deep, and they'll have trouble getting back out of it. And so it still had its risk factors, but it was teachable. And it was interesting that within a 1-month period after EMDR came out, 40,000 of the people that were following us dropped us and went to to Theophostic. And the reason was that Ed said at that point that he could, within 12 hours, resolve every issue in your life that you'd been wasting time dealing with in therapy. So, or money back guaranteed. And so people went, we have been wasting our time with the life model. They're talking about building communities and multi-generational and who knows what and all these all of that's over 12 hours. You've got, you're clear to go for the rest of your life. And so at some point then, let's see, how can I tell this story more quickly? We and Ed were trying to work together because we're trying to get one unified model for everybody. So we want Ed Smith to be a part of what we're doing. And we want to be a part of what every other person who's looking for healing is doing. So we're trying to create this unified community, and Ed's trying to roll out a product. But there seems like there should be something to work together. But the end result was he invited Carl Lehman and myself to go to one of his trainings, and we would go over it together. And Carl Lehman and I had never met, but we went through his training, and we recognized the MDR, and I'd been actually to the neurology discussions with Alan Shore about how EMDR might or might not work, and so I had all this theoretical background. Carl had his own set of background in the brain. And after the conference we said, your stuff works marvelously, but your explanation doesn't match what the brain does. And so he said to us, well, I don't want to learn from anybody. I want to learn everyone from myself, so I don't want to hear from you how the brain works. I'm going to go ahead and do my own thing. And so this is, it's some of the things that we have encountered, and I could go through a long list of people who have said to us, I don't work with anybody else. One of them was very funny. He was writing a book on Christian community at the time. We spent a day with him. He said, I don't work with anyone else. Every man has his own vision. Bye. There's things you sometimes just have to look back and laugh, But we're coming back now to saying, as things have gone on, the picture has become clearer and clearer in terms of what the theory is and how it works. At the time, Carl Lehman was our biggest critic. He would stand up in conferences where I was speaking, interrupt my speaking and tell them that I was wrong about this Immanuel kind of process that I was talking about. Because being that he was starting with the Theophostic side of things, he said, well, what you have to do is get people in touch with their pain. This is what it's all about. If you can get them into their pain, that's great. And we were saying you have to get people in touch with Jesus. And he would get up and argue with people in the conferences and try to prove that I was wrong. So I thought to myself, you know what? Carl, of all the people in the world, is the one who's taking our model the most seriously. He doesn't like it. And he'll spend hours proving that we're wrong. What if we are wrong? If I can engage Carl, one of two things is going to happen. He's either going to show me the flaws in the model we've got, or I'm going to win Carl. It took 2 years, meeting Friday mornings, he and I, every morning. One morning after about 2 years, he called up and he was furious. Any of you know Carl? Yeah. All right, you know he's a little bit labile some days, right? Good clinical word, means he can get upset. He said, oh, I'm so mad at you, Wilders, I'm going to have to rewrite 2,000 pages on the web. You know what it means to rewrite 2,000 pages on the web? Because he had realized that his theory actually didn't match how the brain worked either. But since then, two things have happened. One is, I am now much more solid. Up until then, I taught the life model very hesitantly. Have a look at this, think about what it looks like. But after someone looked at it over as carefully as they could, with having the most qualified education of anyone I can think of, and they said, you know what, this actually, you know, I'm going to pick this up and teach it myself. When that happened, my confidence in teaching the model went way up. And furthermore, I stopped teaching the Immanuel process. Because now who does it? Carl? You know, we've got a staff of what, 3 on a good day? You have Carl willing to write thousands of pages and not have to pay him a dime? And he'll do it with passion, and he'll engage every possible topic and try to figure out, you know, this is how I think engaging with each other as community works out. And so it was a little while after that Charlotte named it the Immanuel process. Up until then, we were calling it the 7-step process, and then we got down to a 5-step process, and then we got it down to 3. And what had happened was it became more and more contagious. And we found out that you could actually do it in large groups of highly traumatized people with hundreds of people at a time with 0 side effects, which you couldn't do with Theophostic or EMDR. Because as long as people stayed connected with God and feeling thankful, it provided the safeguard that they didn't go into it too deep. You just let God guide them into whatever they were able to deal with that day. And we found interesting things, like God would guide them in. They said, you know what, we're not going to look at any traumas today. I don't know what you thought you were doing. You and me are going to just sit here, and I'm going to understand what it means to be quiet together. It was interesting that what would happen is I was guiding people in the process. Right about this time, one of the fellows came in and he says, you know, I decided, why should I wait till I get to your office? I have to drive like an hour and a half to get here. Why should I wait to get to your office before I connect with Jesus? So, I mean, when I got in my car this morning, I said, well, Jesus, are you here in the car? Oh, well, there he was. He's sitting over there. And I thought, well, okay. Well, why don't you talk to me while I'm driving into Wilder's office? And so Jesus was talking to him. So he came in the office. He's all aglow. He says, you know what? Jesus wants to tell you that he creates kids with lots of be-like stuff. The be-like stuff. I'm thinking, I said, that makes no sense to me at all. He says, well, Jesus wants you to know that you don't understand what he's doing right now, but if you watch him, you will learn from what he's doing. I said, well, that's true. No, be-like stuff. He's created children with a lot of them that's supposed to be like somebody. And what's happened to that be-like stuff, that there's a lot of it in there, that's what we're talking about right here. And to me, that really is probably the best description I've ever heard of the brain. It's lots of be-like stuff. It's got to be like something. And we're trying to help it be like the way that it would remind everybody of Jesus. Oh, you are so be like Jesus that I just can't, I can't be sure whether you're thinking or you're talking or he's thinking or he's talking. And I'm sure he doesn't look like you, but you sure be like him a lot. And with that model, all of a sudden, there's a simple context in which to put together all the neurology and all the theology and all of the church life. So far, so good? All right. So now we're trying to look at how do we roll this out. And so we are running the Connexus program. We're actually creating it. So some of you know the Connexus program, which was the next thing that happened after Chris and I started training this with bonded pairs. We said, well, most of the people that need the training don't have a bonded pair. In fact, I used to ask people when they came in for counseling, I said, well, who are 5 people who could pray for you while you're in counseling? And they would say, if I had 5 people who would pray for me, I wouldn't be here. It was 100% of them said the same thing. I said, well, then the first thing we have to do is find 5 people that will pray for you. And the interesting thing is the longest it ever took was 3 weeks. But we did nothing else. We looked for the 5 people that would pray for them while they were in counseling, that would support them, that would be their people while this was going on. And so we said, well, we should be able to spread out this building joy into the community if we could do it in groups of 3 instead of groups of 2. Because the orbital prefrontal cortex will do groups of 3. That's the family bond. It'll engage with other people. And you know what? Every time you share joy in groups of 3, you don't end up in bed together. None of these other malfunctions happen. It's always when you try to keep other people out of it that you're going to get in trouble. So we build it in groups of 3. That might work. And so Ed Corey, and again, how we met him is completely funny. They created an international conference in Canada, and they invited me to be a speaker. And then they were going to invite all these other speakers, and none of them were coming. So every time they would call me back, they'd say, well, could you take another hour? Could you take another day? Eventually, I had pretty much the whole conference. I was the only speaker, and I said, well, you know what, I'm going to have to teach everything I know. If you're going to give me, 4 days, all day long, every day. And I'm going to have to throw in the stuff I know about addictions. Now, for 3 years, I had been writing to everybody that did addictions, and I never got back one phone call, one email, one letter. Not one of them ever answered back when they were trying to say, here's what the model says about that. No response at all, so I thought this is a complete waste of time. But 3 people from Florida, from the International Association for Addiction Recovery, felt that God said to them, you should go to Canada to this conference. We don't know why, because it's a trauma conference, but we should go up there. And so they showed up, and they're sitting there, and one of them was Ed Corey. And he, all of a sudden, he kind of walked up to me and said, you have finally explained to me how addictions work. I've been puzzled because none of the explanations I know actually explain why it works that way. So I said, great, why don't you and I work together? Oh, he said, I've got no degrees, and I've got no certifications, and I've got no anythings. I said, well, pray about it. Now, Chris had also said to me, well, I got no degrees, I got no certifications. I didn't even have to tell him to pray about it. I just told him that if he'd do it, I'd do it with him. And he goes, okay, it's good enough. Ed had to pray about it. Oh, by the way, that conference in Canada is the only conference that never ended up paying me for my travel fees or anything else. They just we never got enough money, so we're not going to pay you any of your expenses or travel. Sorry, guy. But the whole Connexus thing came out of it, along with a worldwide network of people who were interested in the life model, who had gone up there to hear other things, but they just spent the whole 4 days listening to how God is in the middle of it all, which wasn't actually what they were even planning to hear. So, sometimes God pulls off these, really interesting connections, right? So we're trying to develop the module 3, the one that's called belonging. We designed it and ran it, and it didn't work. We redesigned it. 6 times tore it down and rebuilt it because 5 times it didn't work. So we're on the 6th time this time. We're test driving it to see, will it actually create belonging? Now, the thing about it is that we found that we couldn't get people who didn't have relational skills to stay in a community because they didn't have relational skills. And what we found is that all of them were waiting for someone to create belonging for them. But the normal human development is you create belonging for people around you. So the longer you wait for others to create belonging for you, the more abnormal you become. And because it doesn't work, the more you feel like I'll never have it, right? Because that's just the wrong dynamic for it, right? So, so the idea is, how do you switch this around and teach people who don't believe they know how to get back to creating belonging? Because it's the thing they didn't learn because trauma stopped them, right? So we're trying to put them, you can see how the model comes together, right? You never learned the skill of creating belonging, so how are we going to do it in a group without you blowing it all up before we have a chance to do it? That's the whole thing we're trying to do that wasn't working. 2 people in that group understand that what grows in community. And it often grows from some of the elements in community that we wouldn't have thought would come from. And it almost always includes some of the elements we did know should be there. And so as we're looking, how do we make this grow around us? I want us to be thinking, I know there's some elements that need to be there. And there's probably some elements that I wouldn't have thought will become an active part of this. In fact, what I really think the main description of that element is the people have to be just desperate enough. So David, the psalmist, surrounded himself with a group of desperate men. And if you want to ask me who is at the center of the life model, it's people who are just desperate enough. And you become the change agents that take this into the world and develop something with it that wasn't there before.